currently manifesting itself when it comes to the beneficiaries of the BEE. In certain quarters, the beneficiaries of the BEE criticizes the policy, like the likes of Mampela Rampere, precisely because in the past they benefited, but because they disagree with the current administration, they simply use the BEE as a weapon against this current administration. And secondly, the other example is Ndletyana, who is also a beneficiary of the system, but at the same time is the strongest critique of the system. Thank you.
We understand these critiques. We talk about the class, factionalism, trying to kind of divide up into more heterogeneous groups, this idea of a kind of black or a white homogeny, And I'd just like to carry on. It's again a genuine question like this there in the corner. What does black and white mean in your analysis? Yeah, I don't know. I've only been back in South Africa from France the last 3.5 years. And I find it very troubling to me, actually. We've got analyses like this. We talk about black and white. I mean, myself, I've got 3 nationalities. I speak 3 languages. I don't feel myself to be any kind of a white elite. And I know that, especially in a city like Johannesburg, you have, very interesting demographics, diaspora, immigration, emigration. So this is my question, really. What is it? Instead of looking at what does black empowerment mean, I'd like to know what does black mean, and what does it mean for you? And this is actually for Mcebisi, if you could answer this or not. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, I think I'm David again from Mr. Well, I think for me, really, social progress happens. This is my view. Social progress happens in 2 different ways. In a revolutionary fashion, in the style of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro walking into Havana, putting in the red flag, and therefore replacing one social order with another, and that's revolution. That's change. And that's social progress, right? At a political, economic, ideological level. The other one is of course, the developmentalism model that you can find in South Korea and Japan and so on. Wherein, and I make a distinction between aspirant black bourgeoisie, as well as the political elite, as different strata. And as well as, in the case of South Africa, the white established capitalist class. In the case of developmentalism, there comes a moment where certain countries and certain societies, at the level of the elite, both the political elite and the economic elite, take a deliberate class suicide decision to, in the interest of broad social progress and national development, concede to certain interests that they might have at a particular time in history, and therefore agree that they will, in the interest of their collective class interest, will forego certain immediate gratification and benefits for the greater good, and then uplift a whole lot of people, millions and millions of people out of poverty. And in the case of South Africa, I want to argue that one of the things that make that almost impossible or difficult is the race question. But there's no social cohesion between the political elite and the economic elite. Because the economic elite is predominantly white, black, and the political elite is predominantly black. And in the case of Japan, Asia, and others, including even the Scandinavians, there has been cohesion at that level. So for me, I think black economic empowerment is useless and backward. Because Frantz Fanon concluded on the question, if it is not to become productive in the ratchet of the earth, pitfalls of national consciousness, it's what you actually find here in South Africa today, where now be social distance between the highest echelons of the aspirant black bourgeoisie as well as the lowest ranks of the black population. And you do not have progress. And what you actually have, it's social strife, inequality, poverty, and violence that is brutal, that you find. So for me, I want to know how we can create this social compact that could be necessary. Because I think it's possible. It can be done. It has been done in history, elsewhere in other societies. That the political and the economic elite get together and forgo their narrow interests and uplift society as a whole. Thanks. Or otherwise, then we work in the style of Havana and Che Guevara.
I'm quite understand what you're disagreeing with. You're saying exactly what I said. And the level of the question, I don't see the question in what is white or black. That question, I don't see a question in what is supposedly a question, because that statement suggests a certain level of mystery. What is, I mean, knowing what you know about South Africa and to ask what you think is a mysterious question is what is black, what is white. I don't have an answer to that. Well, I don't know what, I can't quite identify the mystery in it. So I don't have an answer to it.
Like immigrant groups, different population groups.
Perhaps what I answer.
Where are they?
I don't know where to start. Let's start with what is black. I'm looking at black economic empowerment. If you don't look at the word black when you're looking at BE, I think you're in a bit of a quandary. But obviously the larger issue is, I suppose it goes back to that debate, which I don't particularly want to get into, because I think it goes round in circles and doesn't really go anywhere, is the business, well, obviously an argument coming from the right, well, BE and race-related legislation, race-based legislation is a reversal of apartheid. I mean, that's the problem. You can get into that sort of argument, which isn't really very helpful. But it is very, very clear with the association of blackness and poverty, then you need to have some sort of redress policy. So perhaps we should, if it would help, we need to be thinking about redress rather than being as such. I don't know. I can't answer that. I think I've got the same sort of problems as Mcebisi. I think the question was put back to Mcebisi actually about was black business ever homogenous, and I don't think it ever particularly was. I think if you go back to the emergent black business class certainly in the 70s and 80s, you had quite different elements. There was quite a differentiation between, for instance, the emergent black business types in the homelands and those in the urban areas, and those were fought out regularly in NAFCOC and so forth. But I would rather guess that as the boundaries began to fall down during the transition, that those differences rather dissolved. Now, no one's really, and it's something I've often sort of wondered what's happened and would have liked to have tracked. What happened to those black businessmen, for instance, in the Bantustans, after the transition? Where did they all go to? If you go to the Transkei, which is the one area I know best because I did early work with the Transkei, in terms of ownership of various assets, there was, let us call it a black business class. After 1994, that seemed to disappear quite quickly. The Bush Telegraph has it that some people just simply moved off to urban areas. And of course, what happened to the assets they had is they steadily seemed to be taken over successively by Ghanaians, Pakistanis, Chinese, returned large-scale white capital. So I'm just wondering what happened to the circuit of, if you like, the circuit of capital. What happened to all the traders in Afghanistan? Where did they go? did they just disappear overnight, or did they head off into the urban areas and then sort of merge with the types who were previously fighting in that war? So I think it's actually quite a very complex question, which nobody has actually seriously tracked the differences and the commonalities in the black business class around that period and during the transition. Gavin, I think the easy answer to your question is yes, I agree with you, because I think you need to clearly have a proper class analysis of what we mean by the black business class. And I think conceptually there is a distinction between those who, I suppose, have moved into simply share ownership and those which elsewhere I refer to as the party state bourgeoisie. And I think that on the whole we tend to increasingly what we might see as the black business class is essentially become part of the party state bourgeoisie. They may not be involved directly in the party, they may not be directly involved in the state, but they feed off connections with both to be able to accumulate assets. Whether that results in productive capital or not is a different story, but I think that's where it goes. And I think that's the problem which we have with many of the people who are described as black business, is that they are simply buying off the connections to the party state. The problem is they will say, that is the best opportunity we have, where else do we go? And I think that's part of the conundrum of where we are at the moment.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes. We can take 2 more questions. At the back there, I see a hand.
I'm Caesar. Mcebisi, sorry, with regard to the question that my brother has raised there, that what's the meaning of black? And what's the meaning of white? I don't think it will be appropriately correct for you to just handle the objective in such kind of an authoritarian way. Because yes, before we can go deep into the black economic empowerment, now I truly believe myself in the sense that black in itself is racial bicultural, black and white. Because if you say black, as is defined is the color of death, the color of so forth. If they are done with you in the society, you are blacklisted, there's blackness and so forth. And white is security, clarity, and so forth. So I truly compliment his question. I believe it has to be answered. Because if you say they are white people, why should we call Chinese Chinese? Because they come from China, that's their origin. We are Africans, you understand? So if it comes to black economic empowerment, in itself it's a sin, and it can't make sense before we really understand what do we mean by black economy. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Simon Weber once again. I'd like to bring us back, if I may, just briefly to the NWW lens, to the 2 books that we have spoken about, in which you in fact put to us. One reading of the NWW approach is a very somber one, and my question is, I'm going to give you 2 aspects of where I see it to be somber, and I'd like some kind of reply, whether you agree with that interpretation. I mean, the first is that to become an open access order, like in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, is it takes a long time, it takes centuries, and there is no path that we know of. There is no developmental path that takes us there. I think they're very clear about that. What happens to, as we are, the South Africans are, the limited access orders, is that we can advance or we can regress. And we advance or we regress in terms of changing alliances of elites who are viable when they are able to control collective violence, and as you have changes of rents and of the economy, you then have changes of the alliances, and one can advance or regress. There is no path toward developing a limited access order to become an open access order. That doesn't mean we can't do that, but they're pretty somber and depressing about that. The second somber aspect is about the clear and present danger continually of collective violence, which we heard about during transition in South Africa. There was a lot of collective violence, and if we can just look at the 1990s, this continued the fear of collective violence. So in a sense, the alliance of elites that we're speaking about after 1994 was an alliance put together to try and control the clear and present danger of collective violence. So in that sense, if I may just put it to BEE, is not a co-optation by capitalism. It may well be that, according to NWW, but NWW would say in the first place that BEE is buying in, is co-opting new elites so as to be able to try and have an elite coordination to avoid the clear and present danger of collective violence. In a sense, and I wanted to ask Aurelia and Nick about that, and I think you raised this right at the end, and I'm not going to be very long, I'd just like to make the last point. In a sense, I don't know whether the ANC leaders had a choice in the 1990s, because there had been a pact already closed between big business, big white business, and the ANC overseas. You then had all of the violence of the transition. I was in KwaZulu-Natal. We went to the Eastern Transvaal, and then there were all sorts of rumors of the white farmers were going to burn their crops. There were local governments that were still in white and in white conservative hands. There was Botswana and there was KwaZulu. Both these Bantustans had to be trans. There was a whole fear of collective violence right through, I would say, to the 1999. So during this period, I don't know whether there was a choice. I mean, I know there was an alternative on paper, but I don't know whether there was a choice, because, and this is very somber, this is saying that these elites are captured in this viable alliance so as to avoid what they continually have somewhere in the back of their minds, and that is it's all going to explode. And that is a second that's the shadow of violence. That is a second very somber view of NWW. So I suppose I just wanted to put this. I don't know whether this is the only interpretation, but these two somber streams of thought, I think, are very important to what so far here I have taken to be a somewhat optimistic discussion of transition, continuing transition in South Africa.
Simon, I think I broadly agree with you. It is, I think, in one way, it's a profoundly depressing book in the way that they see humanity. I mentioned earlier, I see it as a sort of Hobbesian analysis, essentially. And the whole point of the Hobbesian analysis is you form some form of social contract where you limit, how do you control violence. We're not talking in Hobbes, we're not talking about justice and equity, we're talking about controlling violence in many ways. And I think that I think I did mention it briefly at the end, but I think that NWW, they do have I think their perspective does bring value in the sense of trying to help us to understand the instruments and the mechanisms whereby what could have become a much more violent transition than it was. I mean, it was pretty violent as it was, but it could have become a lot worse. How, in fact, we got from A to B. And even if we don't particularly like the outcome, I think that we have to go back and remember the importance of that process in, frankly, just limiting the body count. And I think that, speaking with my political science hat on, I think one of the first jobs of any government is to keep, or should be, to keep the body count as low as possible in terms of its governing process. And I agree with you, what they're calling for is a very long-term process, and saying we may not get there anyway. So that's fairly gloomy. But I think the other point that you mentioned, which I think is also important, is this stress that limited access orders can go backwards as well as forwards. And I think that's something for us to remember as well. It is quite a sobering thought, given perhaps what's happened next door in Zimbabwe, which has undergone some sorts of similar processes and has definitely gone backwards. And it is, NWW is something of a counter to some of the more utopian images which get put forward. Going back to the first question, going back to the race question again, I can't offer a satisfactory question. I think the whole issue of race at one level is obviously about identity, and the problem comes when you try translating issues of identity into issues of legislation. And then I think you run into all sorts of difficulties, as the absurdity of apartheid legislation is demonstrated to have. On the other hand, it raises the dilemmas if you want something called redress, race redress. How do you implement it without